Hi, this is your guided tour for creating and entering data from a curriculum map in MasteryConnect for your microphases and cycles of your EL benchmark data. Welcome, I'm Barbara Truitt, one of the K-5 literacy specialists. On behalf of all the literacy specialists on my team, we are happy to welcome you to this session today. You will find an agenda with linked resources at the bit.ly on the screen, Microphase Tracker. If you have questions as we go through this session or any lingering questions at the end of the session, please check out our FAQ. If there is a question that you have that is not answered on the FAQ, there's a link for you to submit a new question, and we will reply back to you in email and put the answer to your question on the FAQ. Let's get started by looking at the big picture. We know that the EL skills block assessments are listed in the 2021 Balanced Assessment System as a K2 diagnostic tool to provide information about early literacy skills. We have created a series of EL microphase curriculum maps and trackers in MasteryConnect because we want to be able to provide teachers with a tool within MasteryConnect to track foundational skills. We also want a tool that will analyze and use foundational skill data so that we can plan and create small group instruction. And we want to have a tool for instructional leaders to monitor foundational skills instruction. Let's look at our learning targets for today. I can access and sync the K2 microphase curriculum map. I can create a microphase data tracker. I can enter beginning of year assessment data for students working within various microphases. And I can observe basic reporting features to inform my instruction. This is part 1, finding the curriculum map and creating a tracker. If you have already created a tracker from a district curriculum map, you may be familiar with this process. I am going to explain the process in detail for those of you who still need additional support. First, you want to make sure the settings in your profile are correct. You can do that from your homepage. Underneath your account icon, you can click Edit Profile. Make sure that your role, grade, and subject are accurately reflected in the checked boxes. If you are having trouble accessing a curriculum map, it could be because you do not have the correct role, grade, or subject checked in your profile. Let's go directly into MasteryConnect so that you can see how to find your microphase curriculum map. From MasteryConnect, you want to click in the top menu bar on Maps. You can see that right now I don't have any curriculum maps. I haven't created any for myself. That's because I am relying on district created curriculum maps that are found in the Shared With Me section to the left. When I click on Shared With Me, a list of district curriculum maps will appear. I want to make sure that I am clicking on the correct map. I am looking for the grade 1 district microphase map, and I can see that that map is the second map. Once I've located the correct curriculum map for my grade level, I can click Create Tracker from Map. This is going to pull up the Create Tracker screen. My tracker is already named for me and it aligns to the name of the curriculum map. Here I can type in a description if I want. I can also pick a color, and if you have students attached to you in PowerSchool, you can add those students here. If you are an instructional leader like I am, you can add students individually if you want to add some sample students to practice adding data. Your next step will be to click Create Tracker. Part 2. Navigating the curriculum map and tracker. It will be important for you to understand how to navigate the Microphase curriculum map and the corresponding data tracker. On the screen is an image of the first grade Microphase curriculum map. You can see that the curriculum map is organized and color-coded by units. Here, Microphases are organized into units based on the scope and sequence for each grade level. For example, the pink colored unit is the on-grade level cycles and microphases for kindergarten. Blue is the on-grade level cycles for first grade, and goldenrod or yellow is the on-grade level cycles for second grade. At the bottom of the screen, you will notice 3 beginning of year assessments. There is 1 assessment for each of the on-grade level scope and sequence cycles. Some students may need data entered in for more than one of these assessments because we know that students in kindergarten through second grade perform in a variety of microphases and cycles. Here is an expanded version of the curriculum map. You can see my kindergarten unit is still condensed, but my first grade unit has been expanded. There is a microphase standard. Here, middle partial alphabetic is shown. The cycles within middle partial alphabetic act as substandards. Cycle 1 is short vowels, and cycle 2 is short A and the TH digraph. You can also see the beginning of year assessments that align to that grade level scope and sequence. The microphase tracker mirrors the organization of the curriculum map. You can see on the left-hand side your list of students. Next, you'll see the overall standard, in this case, late pre-alphabetic. The standard is followed by its substandards, which are the cycles. On the screen, you can see late pre-alphabetic cycles 1 through 8. It'll be important for you to scroll through all of the different cycles so that you can see that there are the first grade cycles with a microphase standard, cycle substandards, and again in second grade with microphase standards and cycle substandards. At the very end of your tracker, you will see the assessments. This is where you will enter your beginning of year EL benchmark data. Depending on the level of your students, you may need to use the kindergarten scope and sequence, the first grade scope and sequence, the second grade scope and sequence, or you may need to use a combination of all 3 assessments. Before we finish this section, it is very important for me to remind you that you do not want to try to clone or recreate any of the curriculum maps or trackers provided by the district. This is because if we update any information, you will not be able to receive the updates in your tracker, and student data will not show up in the reports correctly. Part 3, entering microphase and cycle data from your benchmark assessment. Before entering your data in your tracker, you will want to have access to some materials. First, you're probably going to want hard copies of your EL benchmark assessment scoring sheets for each student. You may need your letter sound identification, your decoding, and your spelling assessments. You may also want hard copy or digital access to the 2021 Microphases and Cycles Teacher Assessment Guides. These are the guides that are part of the MasteryConnect assessments, but it may be helpful for you to have a separate copy to use. You might want late pre-alphabetic to middle partial, the kindergarten scope and sequence, middle partial to middle full, the first grade scope and sequence, and late full to late consolidated, the second grade scope and sequence. This assessment guide will help you to determine which benchmark assessments you will need to enter data for different microphases. On the left, you will see the microphase headings, for example, late pre-alphabetic. Under each microphase heading, you will see the cycles. It is important to note that the cycles align to the MasteryConnect criteria number. On the right-hand side of the chart, you will see which benchmark assessment to use to rate student mastery in each cycle. In late pre-alphabetic, you start with the letter sound ID. Then, in early partial, you'll use a combination of letter sound ID and the partial alphabetic decoding list. By the time you get to middle partial alphabetic, you will be using the spelling lists. We always default to spelling lists when determining microphase mastery because we know on the science of reading that encoding or spelling shows a true level of mastery of that spelling pattern. When scoring the assessments using the MasteryConnect performance grader, mark 1 for each criteria or cycle the student has mastered on their assessment. Mark 0 for each criteria or cycle the student has not yet mastered. You will also mark 0 for a cycle for which you do not have data. Do not leave any criteria blank. Use your aligned EL benchmark assessment data to determine if students have mastered the cycle spelling pattern. Remember, even if you don't have data for every cycle, you will have additional opportunities to add data points throughout the year. When you're ready to add data to your tracker, at the top of your MasteryConnect menu, you will click Tracker. Then you will find your microphase tracker. There are 3 possible assessments to enter data for the beginning of year benchmark period. You will want to hover over the gray box so that the full name appears. Here on the screen, you can see the assessment is beginning of year, district, late pre-alphabetic to middle partial microphase assessment. And this is grade 1 because I'm assessing grade 1 students. Once you have found the assessment that you are looking for, you will click on Grade to launch the Performance Grader. The Performance Grader layout will have students listed in the left-hand column, the assessment guide will be in the middle, and the scoring section will be to the right. Some helpful scoring reminders are: make sure that you have selected the correct student. It is very easy in MasteryConnect to accidentally scroll to a different student than what you intended. There are 2 places you can scroll between students: on the left-hand menu and also above the scoring section using the arrow buttons. As you are scoring a student's performance, make sure that you click every criteria and don't leave any blank. When finished, click Score Assessment to save your result. Now we are going to practice with our first data scenario. This is student 1, Ashley Banks. On the screen, you can see Ashley's letter name and sound ID scoring sheet and her partial alphabetic decoding scoring sheet. If you want to look at these examples up close, you have access to this example student data on your resource agenda. A little bit of background information about Ashley is she is a first grade student who was administered the beginning of year EL benchmark assessment. She is currently working in the early partial alphabetic phase according to her assessment data. Because of this, I am going to start entering her data in the BOY District Late Pre-Alphabetic to Middle Partial Alphabetic Assessment Guide. Before we enter Ashley's data into the tracker, let's take a closer look at her sample assessment. Again, you can reference the same sample set through your agenda and resources that was shared at the beginning of the presentation. I can see in Ashley's letter sound ID assessment that she has mastered many of her letters and sounds. I also can tell that there are a few letters and sounds that she is still working on, specifically X, D, I, P, O, and I in lowercase. As I'm entering data for Ashley in the Microphase tracker, I'm going to need to make sure I reference those data points. Now, let's look at Ashley's decoding assessment. We can see that she read some words correctly, but she did not read many words correctly and automatically, and she has several words that she read incorrectly or did not read the word at all. We will use these data points as well to enter into her tracker. Now I'm ready to enter Ashley's sample data. I am going to scroll in my tracker all the way to the end where I can find my district assessments. I want to hover over to make sure that I am looking and using the correct assessment. In Ashley's case, I want to start in the pre-alphabetic. This is the assessment I want, late pre-alphabetic to middle partial. And I am going to assess, and I am going to click in Ashley's name, and I'm going to click grade to launch the performance grader. We already looked at an image on our screencast of what the performance grader looks like, so this should look familiar. I have my students here, and Ashley's name is highlighted on the left and on the right, so I know I'm assessing the correct student. I also have my directions for scoring along with my chart that will help me to know which assessments to use when entering my data. I'm going to start with assessing cycles 1 through 11, and I'm going to use the letter sound ID to do that. I know that from looking at the data that Ashley knows more letter sounds than she doesn't know. So I think it might be easier for me to mark what she has not mastered first, and then go back and mark everything that she has mastered. I know that she has not yet mastered X, and X is part of cycle 9. So I'm going to scroll down to criteria 9 because the cycle matches the criteria, and I am going to mark not mastered for cycle 9. Even though Ashley may have mastered other parts of this cycle, she needs to have mastered the entire cycle in order to score mastery. The next cycle that I want to look for is the one that has the letter D, because Ashley does not yet have mastery of the letter D. The letter D lives in cycle 7. She has not yet mastered that cycle. She has also not mastered the letter P, and that is cycle 2 or criteria 2. And she has not mastered the letter O, and that is cycle 10 or criteria 10. The last place of not mastery in this late pre-alphabetic cycles 1 through 11 that she has not mastered is I, and I part of cycle 6. So we have successfully marked Ashley's letter sound ID in the areas that she has not mastered in cycles 1 through 11. So the remaining cycles in 1 through 11, Ashley has mastered. So I am going to go ahead and mark those cycles all the way through 11 with mastery. To continue moving forward, I want to now assess Ashley's early partial and middle partial still using her letter sound ID, but also beginning to use decoding and spelling. Looking at Ashley's data, I cannot tell if she has mastery of her digraphs based on the letter sound ID, because that is not assessed on the benchmark assessment. And when looking at her decoding assessment, that is also not assessed. Therefore, for cycle 12, I do not have enough data. So I have to mark Ashley as not mastered. Now, looking at Ashley's decoding, I need to see if I can confidently say that she has mastered short A, short I, short U, short O, and short E words. Looking at her decoding, I cannot confidently say that she has mastery of those short vowel sounds when they are within words. So for cycles 13 through 18, I have to mark not mastered yet. Now, there may be a time later where I notice through a snapshot assessment or a cycle assessment that Ashley has mastered those skills. And then I can come back on another assessment and enter new data points to update Ashley's results. I have scored all the way through to criteria or cycle 22 as not mastered, because I know that Ashley does not have enough data to support mastery of all short vowels, short vowel word families, or the doubling consonants rule. Now that I have finished scoring Ashley's assessment, I want to make sure that I have not left any criteria blank, and I'm going to click Score Assessment. Now that I have scored Ashley's assessment, her data shows up in my data tracker for this assessment. And here is what Ashley's data looks like now that it is in the tracker. You can see areas where she has mastered or where she is near mastery or does not have a data point yet. And then in the later part of the tracker, we do not have data because we have not assessed her on those cycles. If you practiced entering data for Ashley, you can check your work here. This screen highlights the decision making I used while entering Ashley's data using the different assessments I had available. Letter sound ID, the middle partial decoding list, and areas where I did not have enough data to enter mastery. Now we are going to go to our next student example, Carlton. Again, Carlton is a first grader who took the beginning of year benchmark assessment. Right now, Carlton is working within the pre-alphabetic phase. Because of this, I am once again going to start with the BOY District Late Pre-Alphabetic to Middle Partial Alphabetic Assessment Guide in MasteryConnect. Before we enter Carlton's data, let's take a closer look at his sample scores. Here are Carlton's sample scores on the letter sound identification assessment. You can see in Carlton's case, he is still working on mastering many of his letter names. Currently, he does not have mastery of any letter sounds. We will enter this data into MasteryConnect. Looking at Carlton's decoding assessment, we can see that he is still working on his CVC words. Now, let's see what this will look like in entering into our tracker. Back in my tracker view, once again, I'm going to scroll all the way to the end of my tracker where I have my district assessments. I know that I need the pre-alphabetic assessment again for Carlton. I'm going to click Assess, and I'm going to click Grade to open up the Performance Grader. I have the same Performance Grader view that I had when I was entering Ashley's data. This time, the student that is highlighted is Carlton to the left and to the right, where I'm going to enter Carlton's data. Looking at my scoring guide and considering what I know about Carlton's data, I am going to enter in his performance on the late pre-alphabetic cycles. We know that Carlton does not have mastery yet of any of his letter sounds, even though he does have mastery of a few letter names. To have mastery in the late pre-alphabetic cycles 1 through 11, you have to be able to do the letters and the sounds, and Carlton can't do that yet. So for cycles 1 through 11, Carlton is going to receive not mastered. Similarly, on Carlton's decoding, he did not show enough mastery to rate mastery in cycles 12 through 18. So Carlton has not yet mastered these cycles. We know he's working within these cycles at this time and gaining more confidence in his letter sounds. I'm going to mark not mastery all the way through to cycle or criteria 22. We can assume that Carlton has not yet mastered these, but we also do not have data on those cycles. I'm going to score the assessment, and my answers have saved. And now I can see Carlton's data in my assessment tracker. And I can see the data again in comparison to Ashley looking at the tracker. If you want to check your work, if you entered Carlton's data as practice, you can check your work here. Carlton received not mastered for all of the cycles 1 through 22. He did not show enough evidence of mastery in cycles 1 through 11, and we did not have enough data in the cycles after that. This tells us that Carlton will be working a lot in small group with his letter sound identification and probably his phonological awareness skills. Let's move to our third student, Hillary Banks. Again, Hillary is a first grade student who took the beginning of year benchmark assessment. She is currently performing within the late partial alphabetic phase. Because Hillary is performing in that phase, we are going to start recording her data in MasteryConnect using the district middle partial to middle full alphabetic assessment guide. This is the assessment guide that falls within the first grade scope and sequence. After we add Hillary's data in the middle partial to middle full, we'll go back and add additional data into the late pre and middle partial alphabetic. Before we go to MasteryConnect, let's take an up close look at Hillary's data. We do not have a letter sound identification assessment for Hillary because she did not need to take that assessment. Based on her decoding assessment, it was clear that she knows all of her letters and sounds. So when we look at her decoding assessment, we can see in her middle partial, she has mastery of all the words on that list. Even the word men, she said man at first, but self-corrected. So she did end up getting that correct. In the late partial alphabetic, she got many of those words correct. In a few, she sounded out. In all, she scored a 7 for words read automatically and accurately. Now let's look at Hillary's spelling test. This is the first spelling test we've looked at for a student in a scenario. Looking at Hillary's spelling assessment, we can see that she has mastered many of the CVC spelling patterns. When we look at the lower section where Hillary starts making mistakes, we can tell that those errors are made mostly within the digraphs. Based on this assessment, Hillary scored a 9, which placed her in the late partial alphabetic phase. Now, let's see what this data will look like when entered into MasteryConnect. I'm going to scroll all the way to the end of my tracker. This time, I do not want to start adding in the late pre-alphabetic because Hillary is a little further along than that in the scope and sequence. So I'm going to go to the middle partial to middle full, and I'm going to assess. Then I'm going to launch the performance grader for Hillary. I'm going to make sure that Hillary is the student that I have selected to enter data. And notice that the assessment guide for this assessment is different. It's the blue color-coded assessment for the first grade scope and sequence, and it shows the first grade on-grade level scope and sequence of microphases and cycles. Looking at Hillary's data, I'm going to start in the middle partial alphabetic range and see, based on her partial alphabetic spelling list, what I can mark as not mastered or as mastered. Notice on this scoring guide, you will see notes that say not all cycles will have benchmark data points. Starting with cycle 1, all short vowels. Looking at Hillary's data, I can confidently say that she does have mastery of all of her short vowels. Going down to cycles 2, 3, and 4, however, the story is a little bit different. Hillary does not have mastery of her digraphs. So for cycles 2, criteria 2, and criteria 3, I have to mark not mastery. In criteria or cycle 4, qua spelled QU, I don't have any data to support rating this criteria, so I have to mark it as not mastered. Going down through the rest of the cycles, again, I do not have enough information to rate these. From criteria 5 all the way to criteria 24, I am going to rate Hillary as not mastered. And I'm going to click score. Here you can see Hillary's performance in the assessment tracker and in the full data tracker. Notice at this time, Hillary doesn't have any data entered in for the kindergarten scope and sequence, but she does have data entered for the first grade scope and sequence. Our next step for Hillary would be to go back and enter data for her late pre-alphabetic and middle partial alphabetic. For time's sake, I am not going to enter that data, but I will show you what that data would have looked like for Hillary. Here you can see the middle partial alphabetic where Hillary only scored mastery in the very first cycle. When we enter Hillary's data in late pre-alphabetic to middle partial, the story looks a little bit different. Based on her letter sound ID, she has full mastery of cycles 1 through 11. She needs work on her digraphs. She has mastery of all of her short vowel words, which gave her mastery in cycles 13 through 18. And there was not enough data on the short vowel word families or the doubling consonants. So this is what it would have looked like if we had had time to enter Hillary's data into the tracker. Our final student scenario is student 4, Will. Will is a first grade student with beginning of year benchmark data. Will is performing in the early consolidated alphabetic. We are going to start entering his data with the beginning of year district middle partial to middle full assessment guide and then end with the late full to late consolidated alphabetic assessment guide. Let's take a closer look at Will's assessment data. Here we can see Will's consolidated alphabetic decoding. Will has a very solid grasp of decoding all the way through late consolidated. Looking at Will's spelling assessment, we can see that he has full mastery of the partial alphabetic list, and he has mastery of the full alphabetic list, with the exception of one error in a vowel team. In the consolidated alphabetic list, Will has mastery of many of the spelling patterns. Will needs work in early consolidated with ending patterns. Let's look now at how we would score Will in MasteryConnect. We are going to start by scoring him in the on-grade level for his grade, which would be first grade, middle, partial, middle full microphase assessment. And I am going to click assess, and I'm going to make sure in my performance grader that I've selected Will. I know that I have the on-grade level for first grade because it's the blue color-coded assessment guide. I have Will as my student that I am scoring. And I know which assessments I need to reference as I am entering Will's data. I am going to need to focus on his spelling data. Starting with middle partial 1 through 4, I know that Will has mastered all short vowels criteria 1, short A and digraphs, short I and digraphs. But when I get to criteria 4, I don't have an assessment that tells me information about Will's progress on spelled QU. So I'm going to have to mark that not mastery because I don't have a data point. As I continue to move through my assessment, I can mark mastery for criterias 5 and 6, short O and short E with 3 and 4 phonemes. For the next few cycles, I do not have enough information based on the spelling assessment. All the way through to cycle 9, I just don't have enough information on WCK, the doubling rule at the end. I don't have enough information on those cycles. But for blends, for initial blends and ending blends, I do have enough information. So I can mark those as mastered. And actually, I can mark mastery all the way through the CVC words in early full alphabetic, because we know based on his spelling test that he has mastery of 12 through 17. When we get to cycle 18, I just don't know if I have enough information. But I do know on his spelling assessment that he has R control mastery. But the rest of the cycles, I just don't know enough information about his mastery level. I am going to score this assessment and save. Here is what Will's data looks like in the assessment tracker. Here's what Will's data looks like in the microphase tracker. When I scroll, I can see that both Hillary and Will have data in the first grade range, and I am going to enter additional data for Will in the late full alphabetic to late consolidated. For time's sake, I'm not going to model that for you, but I do have a check. If you would like to check to see how that data would have been entered, you can look on the slide and see what decision making I would have done for Will in the late full to late consolidated phase. Let's look at our bottom line. When we're entering benchmark data into our microphase tracker, we need to remember that it is just the starting point in determining student mastery of individual cycles. ongoing assessment through snapshots, cycle assessments, and module assessments will be needed to get a full picture of student mastery. Let's move on to interpreting data and basic report. Here you can see a completed view of my tracker with all of my students' data entered: Ashley, Carlton, Hillary, and Will. You can see that I entered data for Will all the way back to the kindergarten scope and sequence, and he scored exceeds mastery, as well as did Hillary. We can see areas where Carlton and Ashley need work. In the first grade scope and sequence, we can see trends where many of the students need work. Now, let's look at some options for basic reporting. When you hover over the name of the assessment in the gray box, a pop-up will appear and you can click on Reports. A reporting box will bring up options for you to choose from. You can select Student Mastery. This is the report that you will see. Along the bottom, it will have all of the cycles for that scope, for that grade level scope and sequence. Here it is the late pre to middle partial alphabetic kindergarten scope and sequence. Across the left-hand side is the percentage of students who are at mastery or near mastery. This gives us a good indication of where students' strengths and inconsistencies are. I can see that I do have strengths within my class in letter and sound identification, but I also have specific students who need improvement in that area. Looking at cycle 12 digraphs, I can tell that this is an area where many of my students in my class need additional support. I have inconsistent information on my short vowel mastery in my class, and based on the beginning of year assessments, I don't really have enough data to know if my students have mastered word families or the floss rule. This basic report gives me a little bit of information to begin making instructional decisions about what my students may need moving forward. We've come to the end of our time together. If you have questions or need support, please reference the bit.lys on the screen. You can refer back to the agenda and resources bit.ly microphase tracker. This will have time-stamped sections of the video so that you can reference specific sections that you need. If you have questions that you need answered, please go to our FAQ and check to see if your question is there. If your question is not already on the FAQ, there is a link for you to enter it and we will get back to you as soon as possible. Thank you so much for participating in this screencast and for all you do to support students in their foundational skills growth. Have a great day.